Oh, hi, everybody. Welcome, and thanks for joining us for our event with Michele Morano and Ryan Van Meter. My name is Evan Karp. I'm the events manager for Booksmith. We're an independent bookstore and a mainstay of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district since 1976. Tonight, though, we are, of course, here to celebrate Like Love, the new essay collection by Michele Morano. With Michele to discuss the collection is Ryan Van Meter. Ryan is the author of If You Knew Then What I Know Now, as well as other essays published in magazines and selected for anthologies, including the Best American Essays. He's an associate professor of creative writing at the University of San Francisco. And Michele Morano is the author of the travel memoir, Grammar Lessons, Translating a Life in Spain. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in many journals and anthologies, including Best American Essays, Fourth Genre, Ninth Letter, and Waveform, 21st Century Essays by Women. Born and raised in Poughkeepsie, New York, Michele lives in Chicago, where she chairs the English department at DePaul University. That's it for me. Thank you all again for being here. Michele, welcome and congratulations on your book. And Ryan, thank you for joining us. I'll turn it over to you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Hi, Ryan.
Hi.
It's so good to see you.
Physical book here.
I have your book right here too.
Oh, very good. I think it's been, I don't know, 4 or 5 years since we've seen each other live in the flesh. So it's really nice to see you and really great to be here to celebrate your book.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited and I'm so grateful to Evan and the Booksmith for hosting and to you for agreeing to chat a little bit. So thank you. Thank you.
Do you want to start and read first? And then we can chat?
Sure, yeah. So I'll start by saying that Like Love is a memoir and essays about unconsummated romance. So it's kind of looking at the various crushes and infatuations and strange entanglements that we get ourselves into throughout our lives. Especially when they don't have a future and we don't even necessarily want a future, but they kind of occasion moments of reflection. So I'm actually going to read from an essay that's called My Sky, My Life. And this is a piece that is about, although you won't hear it at all in the section that I'm reading, it's primarily about becoming pregnant for the first time in my life at 43 and I was like the happiest pregnant woman ever. It was the best drug I was ever on. Then of course I had a baby and the drug went away, but it was really, really amazing. I couldn't be unhappy or anxious or anything during the whole pregnancy. And so the story of this essay is that I go to New York to do a reading and I'm newly pregnant and very nervous and assuming that it's maybe not going to last because of the odds in that demographic. And I go and visit a friend of mine, James, a very dear friend. And I'm about to tell him, first person I've told, that I'm pregnant. So, but he also is somebody who I had a little bit of a emotional past with. So I'm gonna read about that in this section from My Sky, My Life.
Great.
I met James at an artist colony in the Berkshires, where we'd each been invited to spend a month free of charge, living and writing on the former estate of the poet Edna St. Vincent Millay. The setting was lush and fragrant, and the view outside my studio window so green that for the first few days, I walked around in a state of astonishment because someone thought I deserved this, an entire month in a beautiful place. All I had to do was whatever I felt like, write and read and take walks and eat dinner each night with the other residents. There were 6 of us in all, 3 writers, a painter, a photographer, and a sculptor. Only at dinner time did we all come together, and the highlight of each day, the reward for plugging away hour after hour on an essay that wasn't coming together yet, was the moment when I walked up the hill, entered the main house, and approached the table. James was often there already, nodding intently at another resident, his serious expression cracking into a bright smile when he saw me. Over dinner, we talked and joked, dominating the conversation, agreeing on every political topic that came up and waxing sarcastic about the war in Iraq, the upcoming presidential election, the Pope, Scientology. Later, we'd walk back to the barn, the evening air thick with country smells, and share a glass of scotch in the hallway before going back to work. Before long, I was in love with him. I don't mean, excuse me, I don't mean that I loved him. Love needs time, much longer than a month to take root and grow, but being in love, that early dangerous stage of mild obsession, can happen quickly and intensely without one's consent or control. Kevin and I fell in love during the summer when we had an abundance of time together. Mornings, as I ate breakfast on my front porch, he'd walk down the street, book bag over his shoulder, smiling broadly. He was on his way to the library or the coffee shop, somewhere quiet to read and think. But first he wanted to say hello. Sometimes he stopped for a quick chat, rubbing my back and chatting before walking off again. And sometimes we fell into bed for an hour before resuming our separate days. So much of the pleasure of that time came from the growing rhythm, how we collided and spun away, discovering each time we intersected again that we liked each other more. During those early months, I had a recurring dream that one or both of us was married or seriously involved with someone else, that our love affair was laced with regret. Some mornings I woke to find Kevin lying face down beside me, my enormous orange cat atop his back, and the relief of our situation made me giddy. There was no guilt, no sadness, just all the possibility in the world and a welling up of gratitude for how open and available we both were. By the time I went to the Malay colony 5 years later, Kevin and I had settled into a comfortable life. We lived a short walk from Lake Michigan, rode the L to our teaching jobs, visited the East Coast a couple times a year. At the residency, every day I looked forward to arriving home at the end of the month, to sharing a bed and a breakfast table and going out to dinner and to the movies and talking the way we always did. In the meantime, I talked with James. We learned about each other in short spurts, and the daily rhythm of offering bits of story, separating and then coming together again, was as seductive as the early time with Kevin. So much of romance involves seeing yourself reflected back in the expression of someone who enjoys you. And James has the kind of face that shows and mirrors appreciation. I developed the habit of rising early and going immediately upstairs to my studio. After a few hours of work, I would stand up, stumble to the couch, and fall into a deep sleep. James started appearing in my dreams, attending to me, courting me, sidling up and pressing his lips into my hair, speaking into my ear, and the next moment pressing his body into mine in the way that dream sex works, part theory, part metaphor, part animalistic drilling. I would wake sweaty and pulsing. James and I snuck away a few times. We went to bars where we drank whiskey and talked about our lives, about his upbringing in Colombia with a mother who had been his father's longtime mistress until he left his wife and married her, a mother both tremendously strong and maddeningly passive. James's novel centered on an entire town of women like that, women with no idea of their own power until a group of guerrilla revolutionaries forces all the town's men to join their ranks, leaving the women to fend entirely for themselves. Over the next years, the women slowly adapt to the absence of men, and the community that arises looks very much like the socialist utopia men have always fought for but never attained. The women pair up in exquisite love affairs, devise a new way of marking time based on monthly cycles, lose the need for clothing and most material goods. They become Edenic creatures, satisfied by one another, their need for men evaporating. How I loved sitting on a bar stool listening to James choose his words to perfection and pronounce them in a way that was subtle and glowing, as if they were wrapped in beautiful paper. He told me about the novel, which was as feminist a story as any I'd heard, and about his job waiting tables and about how he'd come to the US at 26, leaving an advertising career in Bogota and working menial jobs in New York while learning English. Within a few years, he was accepted into the MFA at Columbia University, which he still seemed to regard as a surprising turn of events. I told James about my book, a travel memoir focused on Spain, and about my family, how my mother left my father in the mid-1970s when lesbianism was a secret so dark it took more than a decade until my mid-20s for me to share the story with anyone. I told him about Kevin, who had happily moved to Chicago when I got a job and who remained as content to live in sin as I was. James was impressed that we weren't married and didn't plan to be, and I liked that he was impressed. I wanted to impress him every day, to dress nicer and write better and be cooler so that the smile he cast on me across the dinner table wouldn't fade. I'll stop there.
That's very nice. I love that essay.
Thank you.
You mentioned that while you're there at the art colony that you're working on an essay that wasn't coming together yet. One of my first questions is, your collection is so tightly organized. There's no essay that really I feel like I could pull out and the book would remain the same. Can you talk a little bit about how you achieved that effect, how this collection came together? Did you say, I'm going to write an essay, write a collection about unconsummated romance and then just start, working down a checklist? Or were you writing essays about like everything and noticed a pattern?
Both. So I was writing essays and noticed a pattern. I actually sat down one day very intentionally and said, I need to make a book. What am I going to make a book out of? I kind of went through my hard drive saying, am I partway there by any chance? And I had a bunch of essays, some I had published and some I had just been noodling around with. And I started thinking, and I had been wanting to write this story of my family's breakup when I was an adolescent, because there's just so much wild stuff in it. And it was it was a time that just burned itself very, very deeply into my brain. I was, 12, 13 years old and paying a lot of attention at that time. And so really kind of memorizing events and feelings. And so I'd been wanting to write that, and I had a number of essays in progress around that. And it wasn't until I started thinking, what's the through line to some of the work I've been doing, that I realized, I thought back to an interview I had read many years ago with Jamaica Kincaid, in which she talked about her mother as the first great love of her life, and also the first big breakup, the first heartache. And I thought, oh my God, yeah, that's exactly my situation too. Because when my mother left my father, she actually left him twice. And the first time my brother and I went with her, and the second time I stayed behind. And then this really horrible kind of fracture happened between us. So once I started thinking, actually, there's a love story here, but it's different than just a love story, right? There's like this offbeat romance that's running through some of my essays. And then I just thought, oh my God, I've got so many of those experiences, And so, then I started mapping out essays, and not all the ones I mapped out or even wrote ended up in the book. But yeah. So,
okay, good.
Yeah.
That helps. And one of the delights, like that it's so tightly focused in theme, but how you manage to use so many different forms is one of the things I really, really love about the book. That each essay kind of has its own distinct personality among all the others. You've got sort of like collage, something more narrative. You've got a list, you've got second person, you've got third person. Some are strictly personal, some fold in a lot of research. Can you talk about how, like, your ideas of essay and form, and maybe tell us about sort of like the relationship between subject and form for you with some of these examples?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And I love talking about form. I think as a reader, I so appreciate when a piece of writing, whether it's nonfiction, fiction, poetry, whatever it is, kind of takes me by surprise and makes me go like, whoa, hold on here. what's this lens I'm looking through? I don't think I've looked at this subject through exactly this lens before. And so I'm always interested in the way that form can give us access to something that we wouldn't have been able to get to otherwise, right? I mean, there isn't too much you can say about love that hasn't been in some way said before or explored. And so I think that it's really important to, and I try to, this is why I think my life would be much easier if I could just write a straightforward memoir, but I lose interest so quickly in that. And so then I end up crafting, individual pieces, which I feel like takes longer, but maybe that's not the case. But I always, I set out to craft an individual experience or set of experiences or a question that I'm trying to explore. And then the form becomes part of the way that I answer that question, or part of the way that it's like a tool I'm using to help me dig down a little more deeply. And I mean, this, you do similar things, right? I mean, you've experimented a lot with form. For people who are not aware of Ryan's fantastic book, let me just give it a plug here. If you knew then what I know now, this is such a beautiful essay collection, and it does use a bunch of different forms. And there's second person and various sort of approaches. So, I mean, tell me a little bit about form.
Yeah. But was there any like, oh, I have to have a third person essay in here, and so what can I write in third person? Or did the material come first and you're like, oh wait, I'm looking at this woman across a crowded room, that woman is me?
Yeah, no, I never felt like, oh, I need to have one of these. In fact, I thought, good God, don't do third person. That's a terrible idea. And I tried really hard not to, but every time I tried to mess around with it, I was like, no, it gets me to something else.
Yeah.
And I still feel like it's risky. It's the last essay in the book that's in third person, and I still do feel like it's risky. And I think people have different reactions to it, and I'm okay with that. Like, some people I think don't love it, some readers. But it just feels right to me. Like I couldn't have gotten to the things I got to in another way.
Yeah. No, I wanted to have a third person essay in my collection, but just couldn't figure it out. And then it was, I don't know, a couple of years later that I finally wrote a third person essay.
Oh,
but then it's too late because the book's already printed. So, you win some.
Yeah.
The last time I saw you was in, I think, Tampa, Florida. And we sat on a patio outside of a Starbucks. And you were talking about this essay that was like giving you so much trouble. And you talked through the whole thing. And that essay, I believe, is All the Power This Charm Doth Owe, yes. Which is the longest essay by far in your collection. Can you talk about like how you overcame that difficulty? What particularly was difficult about it? I mean, I have a million essays that are kicking around because I can't figure them out. So any words of wisdom would be, I think, very helpful.
Well, it's funny, Ryan, when you said I was, talking about an essay that was giving me trouble, I thought, which one of half a dozen could that have been? Like, it could have been any one of them. What was I obsessed with at that particular moment? But that essay is really hard because it tells the story of my getting together with my long-time partner. At the same time that my mother was coming to visit me. This was during graduate school. And so it's kind of it's really a love story about my mother, but the burgeoning romance kind of serves as the vehicle to get us there. And so it was a weird kind of braiding to do. And then I also was trying to be really honest about my own kind of failures as a daughter. Like, I don't think I was a great daughter in many ways, even though I was trying hard to be. It didn't work out that way. So the one of the major problems is that the essay was just too long. I just kept thinking, this is too long. No one will care about this except for me, and especially about some of the things that I feel very tender towards certain moments. And I thought, these are just for me. And so over and over again, I sat down with that essay, and I sat down thinking, I'm going to cut 5,000 words out of this essay today. That's what I'm going to do. And I would cut the 5,000 and I would add, 2,000 more. In addition to, not all on the same day, but in addition to another 5,000, right? So every time I tried to shrink it, it just kept getting more. It's like going on a diet and finding yourself fatter and fatter because you keep dieting. And so at a certain point, I just thought, I'm just going to give in. I'm just going to say, I'm done. The essay is going to be as long as it's going to be. And I just thought, every collection has to have the one really essay that's full of warts, and this is going to be it. So I just had to make my peace with it.
Well, because it's funny, because to me, it feels like so elegant. It feels, it has that kind of, you're going to hate this, it has a kind of ease to it for the reader.
I'm happy to hear that.
Yeah, it just kind of, and it doesn't feel like the longest essay in the collection at all. But I think it's twice as long as any other piece in the book. So, that, but I also think it's also I think it's so important. I think it's kind of
and it's a kind of pivotal essay
of the book.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a pivotal essay because it kind of wraps up the story with my mother and opens this other story that takes up the last little bit of the book. So, but in terms of words of wisdom, here's what I would say. Trust your material. Just trust your material. At a certain point, you have to go, I don't know why I think this is really important to include this episode, but I have to include it because in my gut, it feels important, and not just important because it happened in my life, but thematically important,
Right.
So you just have to go with that.
Right. Yeah. Good. We have a question from the audience.
Yay.
From, you might have heard of her, Barry Borich.
I heard of her.
Was any part of the subject matter hard to get to because it was difficult, tricky, or even made you cringe? Those hard to write, have to write moments. How did you get there?
Yeah, I would say almost every essay in the collection has a moment like that. That's how I know when I've stumbled upon good material, because I do that kind of thing. And I think, oh no. So I have just learned through a lot of trial and error to aim right for that stuff. Whenever I get to something that I think I really don't want to write about that, my experience has been that if you try not to write about something, it just keeps bubbling up. It just gets in your way. It comes out in places where you weren't expecting, and it just keeps messing you up. So I just go right for it. And then later on, once it's drafted and revised, later on, I'll start to worry about, do I really want this out in the world? Or, start thinking about the other person involved.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that rings really true. I say that to my students all the time. You're going to write about what you're going to write about, and you can try to avoid it, but it's probably just going to keep presenting itself and say, I'm here, I'm still here.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think that many of us do write from our obsessions, and we don't have any control over what those are, right?
No.
They just keep returning to you. So I'm always drawn to, I always just have to try to turn off my analytical mind and say, I'm still thinking about that one thing. So it's clearly got something valuable inside of it that I need to excavate.
Right. Why is this looming so large? Yeah.
Right.
I think too that once you write about it, and really plumb the depths of it, you can release it, and then you can obsess about something else.
Sometimes, Ryan, let me ask you if this is true for you as well. I find that sometimes when I write about experience, especially an experience that is emotionally complex or difficult, I end up creating a new memory in my mind. So I have the memory that I go okay, I remember where I was sitting and what happened there. And then I have the written version. As I'm writing it, I create another kind of alternate memory.
Yeah.
And then sometimes I have trouble in real life remembering which one came first. Does that ever happen to you?
Well, I think there's like, I heard this, maybe you even told it to me, I don't know. But in neurology, neuroscience, neuroscientists say that you can't access a memory without revising it. So every time you remember something, you've in some way you've altered it when you put it back in the filing cabinet or whatever your metaphor is.
Yeah, right. It requires imagination to reassemble a memory.
And so thinking about like if you're sitting there for, weeks or however long it takes an essay and you're like immersing yourself in a scene over and over and over and, you're trying to fill in the details, it stands to reason that you would, it mess it up.
It comes to feel very real.
Yeah.
In the way that yeah.
Go ahead. We have another audience question from Emily Maloney this time.
Hi, Emily.
Can you talk about the essays that didn't make it and why?
Yeah, so there was one particular heartbreak of an essay. I still think about that essay all the time. It's a piece that I published actually many years ago in a very different form. And then I completely rewrote it and was so happy with it and felt like it got to something really important. But it was a kind of childhood essay. And so the format of the book is that it kind of toggles back and forth between adult focused essays and adolescent focused essays, adolescent, childhood, teenage essays. And this one, I just had too much in a certain period of my life. There were like 3 essays that were kind of taking place within about a year and a half. And it just felt like too much and I had to let one of them go. And so I had to come to terms with the fact that although I love this essay and I'm really pleased with it now, the work it was doing in the collection overall was not distinct enough from what other essays were doing. But it really sucks because that essay, because I published it previously, I can't publish it again. So the new version is just totally, that was wasted time in a way. In another way, I was working something out and figuring out some things that helped with the rest of the book. There were other essays that never quite got off the ground fully. That is like I drafted and then I thought, I don't know if I'm that interested anymore in this particular experience. There was one in particular that it was a unique experience from everything else in the book, but it didn't seem like it was really, the experience felt like it was more meaningful to me than meaningful for a reader. So I didn't include that one either. Yeah, and then there were others that I really wanted to do. I thought I was going to write one more essay that was about the romance of falling in love with a place, the romance of travel. But the book ended out from underneath me. It just, I figured out that last essay. I didn't know it was the last essay. And then I thought, oh no, something's just happened. Like it's shut down, we're finished. And so then there wasn't room for the other one.
Right. I think you can feel that in an essay collection where someone hasn't been quite so selective, where it feels like, oh, like this is one essay too long, or this is actually the essay that closes the ideas, and so you should have stopped here.
Right.
You can feel that.
Right. So. I think that's true. But Ryan, let me ask you, did you have pieces that didn't make it into your book?
Yeah, I had one that I had a couple. And one of them is almost exactly the same thing that you're talking about, is that it was a childhood story about my brother and I, and hanging out at this a house being built, house under construction.
I remember that essay, yeah.
And I think I wrote it for your class way back then.
Yeah, it was fabulous.
And it just didn't do any different work in terms of the collection. It didn't add anything new. And so when I was putting together my thesis with my thesis director at Iowa, I've talked about this before, but she made me put everything on the table she reserved a conference room for us, and we like put the whole book in order. And she had me say, this is the first one because, this is the second one because, this is the third one because. And when I was rehearsing that at home, like on my bed, because I don't have a conference table at home, I couldn't think of a reason why that one had to have an order, and two, why it was in the book. That wasn't something I was already explaining for another piece. So that one I kicked out. And there was another one which actually does really work thematically, but I just didn't have the energy or the time based on like turning in my thesis to get it completely done. And I did finish it like the summer after. So
by then the book was already,
but it was already accepted and
right,
underway.
Yep.
So and that one I did publish, but I don't know that the book is any diminished for its absence.
Right. I love that idea though of laying a book out on a conference table. And I'd heard that before, but I wish I'd remembered it when I was ordering my book, because I did a bunch of different orders, and even, I mean, really late in the process, I was still going, well, what if I moved this one over here and did this? And I knew it was done when I just got to the point where I couldn't imagine moving any of the pieces to a different spot.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about order. Yeah. Do you have any other insights about that? Did you write any essay for its particular position in the book?
I only, no, I didn't. Initially I tried to order it chronologically, and I think that that works sometimes, but it can just be have a really dulling effect. Chronology is just so uninteresting sometimes, because life doesn't happen in a linear fashion. Life happens all at once, past, present, and future. You're always living in your mind as well as in the real world. And so you're re-experiencing or imagining, and things are layered on top of one another. And that to me is the more interesting thing to explore, is the way that memories inform experiences, and experiences help us revise memories, even as those experiences are happening. Like you suddenly get insight, and then you get insight on one thing that's happening right here, and it just ripples all the way back to when you were 10.
Yeah.
And suddenly you're like, oh my God, I understand that conversation now. That's been a puzzle to me for, 40 years or something. So I'm usually pretty engaged by work that makes me, as a reader, I'm engaged by work that makes me think about time in interesting ways. Yeah.
I think that's right. I'm more interested in like overlap and gap and juxtaposition, and it's much more exciting.
Yeah, I agree.
You're invited into that experience as a reader.
Right. And sometimes I think chronology is, chronological order is a default because we think that readers are going to be confused otherwise, but readers are remarkably willing and happy to do some work, to kind of put things in order in our minds, even as we're enjoying a chronology on the page.
Well, but you also can't guarantee that your readers are even reading it in the order that you put it in, because that's just the way that some readers are.
That's exactly.
And then I think about like when I teach essay collections, I almost never teach them in the order that the writer put the.
Really? When you teach,
like often because of like I don't of page count for homework.
Right.
Let's put these three together because let's put this one. This one's really long, so we'll just do that one that day. And
interesting.
So all this work goes out the window.
Right. Sometimes it does. But that's also why I was, with both of my books, I was really adamant that people be able to pick up and just read one essay and not feel like, I don't know what's going on here. That there has to be just enough background information without repeating yourself over and over again. So it's a tricky balance.
Yeah. This is kind of related to what we've been talking about revision and revisiting essays after a long time. But according to Google, you published About Wayne in the year 2000 in a magazine.
About Wayne was my very first publication.
Yeah. Okay. Congratulations on that.
Yeah.
But it's
a very different. It was a very different form. It wasn't very different, but it was a different form. I revised that considerably.
I was going to say, I remember having read that one and then reading this one. It felt significantly renovated to me.
Yes.
Can you talk about, like, one, the need for that renovation, but two, what the experience was? I mean, like, that seems really daunting for me as a reader, is to revise or whatever, update, whatever you want your verb to be, an essay that's 20 years done.
Right. Yeah. Well, on the one hand, it's really great because I've never published an essay yet that I wouldn't love just one more crack at, right? Okay. So it's always really exciting to go, I can actually do that now. But also, a major difference in that essay is that in its initial version, there was very little narrative distance. In other words, I wrote it as though I, the writer, were fully inhabiting the perspective of the adolescent girl. And I stayed really close to her perspective all the way through. And to the extent that I was signaling to readers that I had thoughts about that experience, I was really layering that into descriptions and action and so forth. There wasn't a lot of exposition in that. And there really was no kind of retrospective exposition from me as a writer. So at the time that I revised it for the collection, I wanted to create more of a sense of a writerly self on the page in all of these pieces, because there's so much time. I mean, some of them take place when I'm 12 years old, and then the last one takes place when I'm 43, so that's a lot of time to span with a single narrator. And I wanted to be able to, shorten the narrative distance in places and lengthen it in others. So I think it just has more of an adult perspective now that zooms in on the adolescent perspective, but steps back as well. So it feels like a much more mature piece of writing to me. And I think in that regard, it matches kind of the tenor of the rest of the collection. But it's interesting. I mean, you know this, Ryan, because you've written about childhood as well, is that it's just such a fictional feeling exercise to recreate as a writer the perspective that you had as a child, adolescent, whatever. And you're not getting things exactly right in terms of your own perspective that you held then. It's always a fiction, right?
Yeah, I think of it as a performance.
Yeah, it's definitely is. And I often think, my 12-year-old self would have called bullshit on this in a heartbeat. Like, she wouldn't have liked this. She would have said, you got me wrong,
Yeah, right.
And so it's always like, it feels like a tiny bit of self-betrayal, but also at the same time, a kind of honoring of what has remained from prior selves and stayed with us and influenced.
Yeah, it feels like selecting and sort of emphasizing certain traits about that 12-year-old self. Right. And then, like letting others fall away to create that, like, I think of it as, I'm not an actor, but I think of it as like acting, like, and I'm hearing like a voice in my head, and that's what I'm trying to put on the page.
Yeah, and getting into
how it would be performed.
Right. And of course, we have to give voice to the unflattering traits, as well as the things that, we would have been proud of at that age. We also have to, now we understand that, okay, there were some issues there.
I err on, the unflattering traits are always more interesting, and I err on that side and like, oh, okay, he should be a little more, a little nicer or whatever. Because I can sort of remember the last line of the original about Wayne, and you're right, it leaves the narrator, it leaves the reader in such a provisional place. Like, we're trusting that that character is going to figure things out about Wayne like much later, right? Mm-hmm. But like what we've seen is her sort of like starting that work.
Right.
But she doesn't give us the insight quite yet.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And I think, I hesitated at the end of that essay in the revision because I thought, is this too open-ended? And then I just thought, I love it sometimes when I'm reading a piece of writing, fiction or nonfiction, and I get to something I think, oh, I know what we're going to have to go through next. And then the author just skips it. And we don't have to go through that. Like, thank you. Right. I really didn't want to go through that icky stuff. Like, I kind of get what's going to happen. We can just breeze over it.
Exactly. 2 years later. Yeah.
2 years later, yeah.
We have a question from Jill Talbot.
Jill, hello.
Writing it all the way from Texas, I bet.
What a great audience this is.
What makes a Michele Morano essay a Michele Morano essay? Or she asks it for me too. What do you think? And what do you wish people saw more in your work? Or what do you hope to try more in your work?
That's a really great question. I think, early on in my writing career, I thought that voice was something that you could change. Like the voice in one essay would be really different from the voice in another essay. Mm-hmm. And I think that's because I was confusing voice with perspective or like point of view. And so I thought, well, if I write in second person, my voice shifts completely than if I'm writing in first person, etc. But I don't think that's true. I think that voice is really very deeply connected to personality and worldview. Mm-hmm. And so I think that my personality and worldview come through in my essays. And I think I'm somebody who appreciates and privileges complexity and messiness and mm-hmm. doesn't shy away from messiness. And also I think that the reason I love the essay form so much is that it's a form that not just allows us, but invites us to puzzle things out on the page and not always to arrive at answers, but to maybe sometimes just refine the question that we're asking. So I think I'm willing to do that. So I think there is a little bit, and I'm also very, very, I love lyric essays and I write lyric essays, but even my lyric essays usually have some kind of a narrative arc. I'm a storyteller, even though I'm not necessarily wrapping things up. Ryan, what do you think of for you? I have answers for you too. But...
I think that in probably everything I've ever written, there is, I'm thinking about or performing some kind of nostalgia. Everything has this kind of always like looking back, and often a nostalgia for like, even because nostalgia in its original sense means homesickness, and a kind of homesickness for even like moments that aren't even necessarily like nice or easy, but just always looking back, always thinking about, and sometimes being homesick for times and places that even weren't my own. Since I've written that book, my grandmother comes up a lot in almost everything I have written about. And I think like even when I was a kid, I was like nostalgic for like when my mom was a kid, when I would be at their house.
Wow.
And, that's just that. So there's always some kind of yearning for something that happened before. There's always, I think, or often, some sort of, this is a term that I heard from Leah Purpura, but the enormous small moment, mm-hmm. a moment that like to a bystander looks like nothing happened right then. But like to the person who is at the center of it, it was like this was monumental. Things will never be the same.
Right.
So a lot of my essays focus on figuring those out and trying to look at those from the inside out. I'm always thinking about images of manhood, images of familyhood, and like being, like the sort of like wallflower introverted person. I think a lot of times I write about like how, like lively and tumultuous it is to be inside that body, even if from the outside it looks like there's nothing going on.
Oh, interesting. When you say you've always been someone who yearns for like looking backwards in a way, do you think that's connected to time? To like your relationship to time and the passing of time and the...
Yes, I'm sure it does, but I can't think of anything smart to say about that. Yes, I think it does. I think, yeah, that's all I can think.
I just feel like sometimes on the most fundamental level, I feel completely undone by the fact that time passes.
Yes.
And we can't go back. Like, that just doesn't make sense in my head on some level. And so I think partly I'm always wrestling with some attempt to change the direction of time or the shape of time.
Yes. Yeah. I've written about that explicitly when I wrote about my essay about Days of Our Lives, which I have watched on and off since I was about 5 years old. And it's really interesting to think about time and to think about like having a lifespan that tracks a soap opera. Like it's older than I am, but people have been on that show since I was, 5 and like the same actors.
Right.
And to think about, but on soap opera, time is like artificially stretched out longer than it really is. But it's on every day. That's a really interesting thing to think about. So that's when I most explicitly wrote about time. It's called The Hourglass. Was in a Days of Our Lives essay.
Yeah. That's cool. What about the last part of this question? What do you think and what do you wish people saw more in your work, or what do you hope to try more in your work?
I like the aspirational aspect of that second question. I'm interested in, I've just started taking a bunch of notes. Like one day I was like, that's a weird little scene and I'm gonna write, I'll just write that down. And then like after a couple of days, I had like 20 pages of notes about my freshman year of college. And it's in some ways revisiting some of the material that I've written about before, about like best friendship as a kind of stand-in for the romantic relationship that I wouldn't allow myself to have because I was closeted.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it was, it's like, it also felt new. It felt like I was like treading new territory. And that was really exciting. And I'm not even sure why it felt like new territory, but it's an age that I hadn't written about yet before. Do you ever find like pockets of time that like you haven't yet taken on as a writer?
I hadn't thought of it that way, but now that you mention it, I'm really excited by that idea. Yes, there definitely are pockets of time I haven't written about. I'm gonna play around with that notion a little bit, because I don't usually think of I don't usually think in that way about what I'm writing about, but it's true. There are, I guess I often think in terms of prior selves. So I think there are selves I haven't written about and they correspond to certain pockets of time.
I'm not like thinking of like, oh, I haven't covered that yet. But
right.
But that it was momentarily surprising that given all of that was sort of like coming through in those pages of notes that I was coming up with, all these images of just like all the boys. It was the first time I had ever lived around like, and spent a significant amount of time around boys of my own age. Because I had always just like been through schooling, all my best friends were girls. And so like, I hadn't really ever thought about like the safety that that had provided. So it was momentarily surprising to be like, well, why haven't you written about this? Like this has been the thing that you've been, this larger subject is something you've been writing about for years. Why didn't it ever occur to you yet? And it, so I'm interested in like why that pocket of time, like why that was sort of invisible for so long.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting. I think that's something I'm very, very conscious of what I'm trying to do next in my writing. And that is to be more sparse. I really and to be more sparse and to really do a radical resisting of linearity. And I don't mean chronology there, but I just mean I'm trying to do a book-length essay that I want to be much more associative than anything I've ever written, and incorporate a lot of personal experience and a lot of research and a lot of different perspectives. And I want to find a way for readers to follow all of that without me needing to, every time I even do a little bit of drafting, I go right toward like trying to connect the dots. So it's going to be a process of erasure, and I'm seeing how much I can take out. I'm really excited by that. I feel like I need to take a poetry class or something. Like there's some bit of my training that I'm missing to prepare me for this next thing. I mean, that's the exciting thing, and also the maddening thing about writing, is that you get really proficient at what you're doing, and immediately you set yourself another task that you're not to carry out.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Can't ever just like sit in ease.
Right. Yeah. Right. Just another thing that's a different color. But I mean, I suppose all artists do that. But yeah.
We have about 5 minutes left. So if there's any last minute questions out there, throw them in the chat for us.
Yeah.
Anything else you want to ask each other?
Well, I want to know about what you're working on now.
I'm still working on the novel that I've been working on since I was 5 years old. I'm kidding. I'm writing it in Scrivener, which is a software program. You might, have you ever used it?
I have not, but I'm curious.
You might think about it for this project, because one of the exciting things is you have this window on the side where you have all like your chapters, and you can like drag and drop them. And so I'm building a novel out of all these really tiny moments in a family car trip that takes place over 4 days, when the father is a sheriff and they're transporting a criminal back to their home jurisdiction. It's something that actually happened to my mother. The whole family turned a family vacation, turned it into a family vacation, but there's a guy in leg irons in the car. But I'm building it out of all these tiny moments, and the software is really great because you can just, wait a minute, that goes up here, and you can just drop it, and then in your larger organization, it fixes it for you.
Right, very cool.
So it's really good for building pieces.
Yeah. This book sounds amazing. I'm really excited for it. And also what you were just saying about the short bits, I just reread this weekend, As I Lay Dying, for another essay that I'm working on. And that is just such an amazing, amazing book in terms of how, not just how sparse it is, but how many points of view are included, and how willing Faulkner is to make the reader struggle. Like, I mean, I've never met a pronoun that, couldn't do without an antecedent.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
It. And what does it refer to? It could be any one of 5 things. But he just kept moving forward. And it's very instructive.
Yeah, I read that actually for this project now a couple of years ago, but I read it, I have really distinct memories of it because I read it on a cross-country Amtrak ride. So it was like a really beautiful way to read that. Like that book is so in motion, they're just constantly plodding forward. Like literally, and to have that, to constantly be moving forward while you're doing it was interesting.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Well, I think we're out of time. It was lovely seeing you.
It was so great to see you too. Thank you. And thanks again to the Booksmith. Please buy Ryan's book if you knew then what I know now from the Booksmith.
I'm Michelle's book first. Congratulations on your book. It's so beautiful. I really love it.
Thank you, Ryan. I so appreciate that.
Thank you both. This has been lovely conversation. Michelle, congratulations on the book.
Thanks.
And you, if you're agonizing over which book to buy, you should just buy them both, maybe.
You're good. It's good companion reading.
Get your essays on, y'all.
That's right.
That's right.
Thank you both so much, and to those of you who have tuned in, thanks for being with us. I hope to see you again soon. Go vote if you haven't voted. Yes. And I'm just gonna keep saying that.
Yeah. Thank you, Evan.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Y'all have a good night and take care.
Okay.
All right. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.